I'd like to first take a moment to thank Jeff Jorgensen and Una Voce for inviting me. It's good to be here. My talk is somewhat connected to holiness. We'll see this towards the end, but it deals with the dangers of modern psychology. And there are a number of them, which we'll see as we go along. And now, this is going to be very contracted, so hopefully you'll be able to follow along. In every science, there are three elements. What the scholastics used to call the material object, which is the object of study. It's the thing you're looking at. So in the case of biology, you look at cells or things that are alive. Then there's the formal object, which is you can look at it from a different perspective. It's the way that you're actually looking at it. So, for instance, the philosophy of animate nature, which is sometimes what it's called, looks at life from the point of view of what the very essence or nature of life is, which is different from biology, which looks at it as what are the chemical makeups, how does this actually, how do these things function on a purely material level. Then there's the method, and that's the way in which you proceed in the science. So the empirical method starts out with a hypothesis. You do some form of confirmation, that is, you engage in some type of scientific research, you perform some type of lab experiment, and then from there you will either confirm or deny your hypothesis, and then you reformulate it. Or in the case of the philosophical method, it principally begins in merely abstracting, is what we call it in philosophy. You abstract from something its nature, what it is. Now, philosophy is very different from the empirical sciences because the philosophy can actually deal with spiritual realities. So, for instance, the First Vatican Council says that we are required as Catholics to believe that we can know that God exists purely through the natural light of reason. We don't need faith. So philosophy can actually study spiritual things. But they're obviously not looking at them from the point of view of revelation, which is what revealed theology does. Now, to shift gears just a little bit, we want to discuss something about human nature. Human beings are composed of body and soul. And the soul, the human soul, is what makes this particular body or your body be a human body. In other words, it's the human being, the essence of a human being is to be a body-soul composite. But we can know through the natural light of reason that our soul is immaterial. Unlike animals, they're purely material. You put something in front of them, they just react. They're basically designed to act purely on a chemical level. But human beings are much different. Human beings are capable of performing actions which are completely spiritual and have no function in the body. So, for instance, one of them is free act of the will. The free act of the will is something which can go one way or another. If it was something exercised in a body, it would be determined by physical laws, and therefore it wouldn't be free, it would be predetermined. Whereas we know the fact that we choose between some things or another, and we're not bound in one way or another. And so we know that means that action that we're performing is not done in matter because it's not subject to the physical laws. There's other acts that we perform as well. For instance, there's certain acts of knowledge, or what we call intellection in philosophy, but all that means is that there are certain acts by which we know some things that are done purely immaterially. So, for instance, a person who reflects on their act of knowing, for instance, you can think of something that you know, and then you can think about the fact that you're thinking of something you know. Now, this might seem a little strange, but we call that reflexive knowledge, and only human beings are capable of it, also angels and God, of course. But human beings can do this. Animals don't know themselves. They just react again. So what this means is that there are certain things that we do as human beings that are completely immaterial. Now what this means is that any valid psychology, that is, psychology being the science of mental health, has to take into consideration the fact that we perform actions which are spiritual or purely immaterial, which means they cannot be subject to the empirical method. That is, you don't form a hypothesis and then you perform some test, and then you measure it, and then you say, we'll see. Because why? Spiritual things, you can't measure them. And so as a result, psychology cannot be an empirical science. The problem with modern psychology is it doesn't understand its proper object, that is, human beings. From the very beginning, modern psychology has assumed an empirical approach to man because it assumes that man there's no difference between a man and an animal. In fact, John Watson, in his text, Psychology as the Behavioralist View, views it. Of course, Watson was one of the big founders and movers of the behaviorist school, says, quote, the behavioralist, in his efforts to get a unitary scheme of animal response, recognize no dividing line between man and brute. It's very clear that modern psychology, from the beginning, now recently there's been some kind of shifting around and changes, but in the very beginning, when it deviated from a philosophical understanding of mental health and went to an empirical, it started treating man just like an animal. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who's a psychologist is always doing something wrong, or whatever the case may be, or that they lead the people that they counsel astray. It just means that modern psychologists, in their theory, don't understand human nature. This is a system. They also have a problem with, many of them are just simply materialists. They don't believe there's anything spiritual, period. So it's not just in man, period. There's no God, there's no demons, there's no angels, nothing. There's no soul. And the modern psychology is based in large part on a systematic rejection of God. Now, this is partly due to the immorality of those involved in the beginnings of psychology. People like Freud and Jung had serious problems regarding the sixth and ninth commandment in their own lives. And you can read E. Michael Jones's Degenerate Moderns or his other book, Libido Dominandi, to see that it's very clear these people had serious problems themselves. Carl Jung, in fact, states in his 2 essays on analytical psychology, quote, simple-minded people have, of course, never separated these things from individual consciousness because the projection of gods, demons, etc. has not been understood as a psychological function. So in other words, we only believe in God because it's a purely psychological function. There's no such thing. This is just projection, he would say. And has not been understood, but the projections have simply been accepted as realities, and their true character never recognized. Not till the age of enlightenment was it discovered that the gods did not really exist but were only projections. They were disposed of, but the psychological function which corresponds to them was by no means disposed of. So what he's saying is people still believe in God, but that's only because it's a psychological real thing. But that's not true. It's very clear you can come to knowledge of God based purely on the natural light of reason, something that you can reason on your own. It's not a projection. It's something which you can reason to and know with a certain degree of certitude. There is also the other problem of the fact that modern psychology has not produced what it claims, mental health. The success rate of your average psychologist is less than 10%. That means that 1 in every 10 people, this is at best, that goes to an average psychologist today can have the hope of being mentally healthy when the psychologist is finished with them. If he uses drugs, his success rate is a bit higher because often only masks people's problems and does not really solve the problem. And in connection to this, the fact that it's been an abject failure, you can see it in the book The Psychological Seduction by William Kilpatrick, who deals with the fact that modern psychology isn't producing what it states. And yet, modern psychology is accepted in all academia, it's accepted in the courtroom, it's accepted in the sanctuary, because they actually use modern psychology to facilitate emotions in people during the liturgy. And so it's everywhere. But modern psychology is not scientific. If it was possible for psychology to be an empirical science, then a psychologist could produce mental health much like an empirical chemist can produce the reaction of water, that is the product of water, from mixing hydrogen and oxygen and heat. So they could produce this whenever they desired, but they can't. This also means that modern psychology has been engaging in systematic fraud for years. In fact, Freud himself used to call his psychological patients goldfish, because they constantly kept the money in, and you kept them on the leash so that you could keep milking them, basically. And if they can't produce it, then they should not claim it, and they should not sit in the courtrooms and claim they know what they're talking about when it's clear. More than one psychologist up there, and they'll contradict. You can get 10 of them up there, and every one of them will come up with a different story. Psychologists often make people more dependent on them rather than psychologically healthy, which means they become more independent. And the reason they do this is because there's no money in it. Also, if they cannot produce what they say, then they should not be allowed to claim that they can. Moreover, it is not psychological, it is not scientific, because St. Thomas defines as science as an organized body of knowledge, so you know a number of things about a particular thing, through its causes, that is, what makes it be that particular thing. Now, modern psychology does not understand human nature, A, because they don't understand the fact that we have an immaterial soul that does immaterial actions. The fact that intellectually we perform actions that are immaterial on an intellectual level, and yet psychology is supposed to be dealing with our mental health, then there's no way it can be an empirical science, because you can't measure immaterial acts of the soul again. So modern psychology isn't scientific because it doesn't take into consideration various spiritual causes, not only those which occur in ourselves, but also other things that affect us psychologically. For instance, God, who can illuminate the mind and strengthen the will through grace. God can cure mental illness just through a single grace. That's all it takes. And yet most psychologists, with the exception of few Protestants, tend to dismiss this out of hand. Then they don't take into consider angels and saints who can pray for us and intercede for us, or angels who can actually enlighten us. They don't take into consideration things like grace, but they also don't take into consideration one of the principal causes of mental illness, the demonic. It is a fact that the demons can affect our imagination, which then in turn affects our judgment, it affects what we will, and if we give into the habits of these, then we actually beget mental illness. They can cause us to be mentally ill, and yet they don't even take them into consideration. In fact, recently a friend of mine who was in medical, he had to do the psychological side of it, where they go and they view people in the psychological wards. And one of the women there was speaking languages she never knew before, she never had access to before, fluently. And so this friend of mine said to the doctor, well, have you ever thought that maybe this is just a matter of possession? He says, no, we don't believe in that. There was a case in Italy, this is attested to by Father Amorth, who's one of the head exorcists in Rome, who said that there was a priest in the late 1800s who was assigned as a chaplain to a mental institution. And as he started looking around at them, he just said, I'm going to start exorcising these people. Within 6 weeks, he sent 80% of the people home with a clean bill of health. So there is a systematic denial that there are different causes of mental illness. Now, obviously, Satan isn't the only cause, but he's one of them, and they don't take that into consideration, which means if he's a cause and they don't take it into consideration, then they're not being scientific. And the root problem of all this is because they don't understand human nature. And because they don't understand human nature, they don't even understand the thing they're studying. They tend not to really fully be able to state with clarity how their theories really correspond to the reality of human nature and human psychology. So what does this mean for us as Catholics? Well, modern psychology is dangerous because not only is it founded by atheists, agnostics, who deny God, but we also see that they deny the natural law. That is, that human beings are structured and designed a specific way by God. God had intended for us to behave in very definite ways based upon the nature that He gave us. And yet modern psychology often counsels people to engage in actions which are contrary to the natural law, that is, the laws of God. It very often encourages sin. For example, self-abuse. It encourages very often sins against the 6th and 9th commandments. In fact, things such as homosexuality are no longer considered deviant behavior, but are encouraged. They're even told to some of their patients, you should explore it, see if it'll help. So what's the point? The point is that if you're going to have and again, not every psychologist is disordered or anything like that, but if you're going to need a psychologist, you have to be very careful that you get a psychologist who has a proper understanding of human nature. And by proper, I mean an authentically Catholic understanding of human nature. Grace builds on nature. If you are psychologically affected by what your counselor tells you, it can mess you up on the natural level, which then impedes the operations of grace. So what does this mean? You cannot become holy unless you have a proper psychological outlook on what you're supposed to do. That doesn't mean that people who suffer from psychological illnesses can't become holy. It just means that in order for them to become perfect spiritually, those types of things will have to be done away with. And normally in the course of it, God might even let somebody struggle with something the whole duration of their life. It just means that God has chosen for that person that they must struggle with that and gain merit in heaven by struggling with this thing that may not have been their fault, or it might be. But nevertheless, the only way we can become spiritually perfect is if we're psychologically healthy. Why? Because if I don't have clarity of intellectual judgment, because I'm psychologically ill, I'm never going to understand how I'm supposed to treat sacred realities, both not only external to me, but also how am I supposed to behave internally in relationship to these things. In the end, I argue in a book that I've recently written that the only real true foundation for an authentic psychology is Thomism. That is the philosophy, the theology of St. Thomas. Now, it doesn't mean that there can't be certain empirical aspects to psychology. Obviously, we have a brain, and a brain performs certain intellectual functions, not all of them. But we do have a brain which is material, and it's subject to certain material laws. And so there is a valid part of what we call psychiatry, which can look at these things purely from an empirical point of view. However, they have to accept the conclusions from modern psychology that what these things mean, for example, what emotions are, what their finality is, what they're ordered towards, what our true intellectual operations are supposed to be, what the natural law is, must come from an authentic Catholic philosophy. Otherwise, they will stand to cause people more problems than they solve. I know a number of people that go to psychologists, and before it's all done with, they're poorer and they're worse off. So what's the moral of the story? If you need counseling, in most cases, go see your priest. But in many cases in which you can't see your priest, then you need to make sure you find a psychologist who's a Thomist. And they're out there. They're very few, but they're very good. And encourage people to have a proper view of this, because it has a direct effect on people's salvation, especially if they're being encouraged to commit moral sins, and it has a direct impact on their spirituality. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.